Welcome everyone to the August meeting of the Litchfield GAR Civil War Roundtable. We are happy to welcome Linda Barnickel as our speaker today. Linda Barnickel is the author and archivist with master's degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Ohio State University. I've always wanted to say that. Her 2013 book, Millikens Bend, A Civil War Battle in History and Memory, received the Jules and Francis Landry Award from LSU Press for the most outstanding contribution to Southern Studies, and the A.M. Pate Jr. Award from the Fort Worth Civil War Roundtable for outstanding research and writing on the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the War. It was hailed as stellar by Civil War Times, and On Point, the Journal of Army History, called it a significant contribution and a must-read. Ms. Barnickel is coming to us from her house in Louisiana, and we are happy to have her. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. We're excited.
Thank you very much. And actually, I'm in Tennessee. I don't actually have a connection to Louisiana except for the book. So, but I'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And can you all see that now? Is the PowerPoint visible?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, you want me to go ahead and start, Bailey, or you still need to set up?
We are good.
All right. Well, I wanted to talk today about Millikens Bend, of course, and I call it one of the most important battles you've never heard of, because most people haven't heard of the Battle of Millikens Bend. Even lifelong people with Civil War interests often have not heard of it. And in fact, I didn't either, and that was partly what drove me to write the book, is because I couldn't find any information about it. But I'll talk a little bit about where it was, what happened, and then towards the end of my presentation, I'll speak a little bit more about why I think it's an important battle, even though it was a very small fight.
I'm sorry, Linda, we're getting some feedback.
Okay, do you need me to stop or continue?
All right, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So one of the first most basic questions is simply, where is Millikens Bend? And it is in Louisiana. It's on the Mississippi River, about 15 miles north of Vicksburg. And in the spring of 1863, the region from Millikens Bend up north to the vicinity of Lake Providence along the Mississippi River was held by the Union forces. This was where Grant's army was gathering just prior to its move on Vicksburg. In the spring of '63, the region between the Washita River and the Tensas River was sort of a no man's land. Both sides were kind of in and out of there, but nobody really held that region. And then the main Confederate outpost was at Monroe, Louisiana. And so this was the setting in 1863. The battle took place on June 7th, 1863. But before I get into the details of what actually happened at that battle, I need to kind of back up a little bit and do some scene setting. So we'll start out in Texas. And the reason for that is because the Confederate troops that fought at Millikens Bend were from Texas. They were part of Henry McCulloch's brigade, composed of the 16th Texas Infantry, the 16th Texas Cavalry. They were fighting as infantry. They had been permanently dismounted a year before. Then there was also the 17th Texas and the 19th Texas Infantry. So these were the forces that fought on the Confederate side at Millikens Bend. Now I want to show you a map here. This is the general region of Texas that these regiments were from. And you see there's a cluster in Northeast Texas, and then also Central Texas. And what I find particularly interesting about this, and the reason I'm showing you this map, is to put the following map in context where you see these starbursts are in the same general vicinity where those regiments came from. And what these represent, the red bursts, indicate locations where fires broke out in the summer of 1860. And they seem to happen more or less around the same time period. And you can see they were scattered throughout Texas. And in 1860, the fear was that these fires had all been deliberately set and they were a signal for a slave uprising. And keep in mind that this is 1860, it's just not too long after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And so there was a great deal of fear that there was going to be a slave insurrection. Not only that, but since that time, historians have done more research and they believe that most of the fires were attributed to spontaneous combustion because of some new matches that had been developed that were not a good match for the Texas summers. And so that is why those fires happened, and they seem to happen more or less at the same time, is because of the hot temperatures of the summer. But at the time, there was this great fear of slave insurrection. The black burst that's on there indicates the location of Gainesville. Some of you may have heard about the Gainesville hanging or the Great Hanging. And it was there that in 1862, over 40 men were hanged. And the reason they were hanged was basically, they were kind of like draft dodgers. They just didn't want to serve in the Confederate Army. They didn't want to leave their families. They're right on the border with Indian Territory, and they were very concerned about the safety of their families. And as a result, they were accused of being Unionists, even though it really doesn't seem like that was the case. It seemed like more they just didn't want to get drafted. But they were hanged and executed. And so I think it's important to recognize that that is the background of the troops that served in McCulloch's brigade at Millikens Bend. Now, they were already in service by the time of the Gainesville hanging, but this is the culture in the region that they came from, and undoubtedly they had heard about these various events. So I think it's important to put that in context. So let's go to Louisiana. So the area where Millikens Bend is right up here, this curve in the river on the border of Madison and Carroll parishes. And this is a map based on the 1860 census. And the darker purple are areas which had the greatest proportion of enslaved African Americans as a percent of the population. So in this region, and you'll notice it's the same area where the Union Army was occupying in the spring of '63. In this region, you had between 75 and 90% of the population were enslaved African Americans. So, and this is in 1860. So you can imagine by the time we get to the spring of '63, most of the white men of military age have already gone off and joined the Confederate Army. Many of the planters in this region have fled to the west, some as far as Texas. And so you can imagine that fear of slave insurrection in this region, again, because of the proportion of the population and also the presence of the Yankee Army. So I think those are two factors to really take into consideration that go a long way to explain what happened subsequently at and after Millikens Bend. So now we're in the spring of '63, Northeast Louisiana. Grant's army is there. They have not yet moved on to Vicksburg, but they're preparing for that. And at first, in small groups, family groups, groups off of certain plantations, but then by the hundreds and then by the thousands, these former slaves are coming into Union lines. Now, at that time, there was a term that the Union Army used for these former slaves called contrabands, There's an interesting story behind that name, but I'm not going to go into that just in the interest of time today. But so anytime you see or hear the word contraband, that means a former slave. So these people are coming into Union lines, and very, very quickly, it becomes a true humanitarian crisis. The Union Army is gathering its strength, gaining supplies. They're getting ready to move out and move on Vicksburg. And then all of a sudden, these thousands of people come streaming into their lines, literally with just the clothes on their backs. And there's no provision for them in terms of food, clothing, sanitation, anything like that. And to my mind, I think of them, the situation as being very much similar to what we see with the Red Cross in the aftermath of a natural disaster. The Union Army tries to get a handle on the situation, and they establish what are called contraband camps. These are basically essentially refugee camps. And that it's not designed to be a permanent solution, but they're trying to do something so they can at least make some minimal provision for these people who have fled to Union lines. And again, the situation is just very overwhelming. So the Union officials decide, you know what, it's springtime. All of these people are from this region. They have plenty of experience with planting and raising crops that will grow in this area. So the Union officials decide to take these contrabands and put them back on the plantations. Now, they're not necessarily returned to the former slaveholders. They are free at this point, and they are, this is very important, they are paid wages. But you can imagine what it must have been like for these families to be told, we need you to go back to the plantation. Now, the idea behind that was that they could then work the land, raise crops to help feed themselves as well as the Union Army. This particular region of Louisiana was very much cotton country and also corn. Corn was a big product in that area. And so that was the idea. And what happens is those plantations end up becoming kind of a forerunner of the Freedmen's Bureau, which the full name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And so many of these plantations had been abandoned by their owners, and so they were there. And so that was the situation in the spring of '63. Now, meanwhile, into all this comes Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas. He is one of the top military officials in the Federal Army. He's coming from Washington, D.C. In today's terms, we would call him a Pentagon official. And so he's very high ranking, and he comes to the Mississippi Valley, and he basically does a whistle-stop tour at all of these various posts of Grant's army. And his mission is, in his own words, to raise as many Black regiments as I can. And what he's doing is he is seeking white officers from Grant's army to serve as the colonel or the corps of these newly forming African-American regiments. So he's out there making speeches, and he's recruiting these officers. Now, these officers are coming from Grant's army. At this point in time, they were to be white men only. They are veterans because they have been serving in Grant's army. And there's a variety of motivations. Some of these men are genuine abolitionists. They have been waiting for this day, and they are excited about the opportunity to serve in what will later be called the U.S. Colored Troops. At this point in time, they're not known as that. So you have genuine, true abolitionists. But you also have opportunists. You have some men who see this simply as a great opportunity for advancement, to get the prestige of the rank of being an officer, and to receive the higher pay of being an officer. One example, the difference in pay is a sergeant in the artillery made $17 a month. As an officer, he could make $60 a month. And so there was a great deal of financial motivation involved in this. Most of the officers that were recruited did jump several grades in rank. So you have sergeants becoming captains, you have privates becoming lieutenants. And so it is an opportunity. In addition to that, it was believed at this point in time that Black troops would be not on the front lines, that they would serve garrison duty. And so not only was this a chance to get better pay, to get increased rank, but the expectation was that it could be kind of a cushy job, because there was no expectation that these Black regiments would fight. They would just be serving garrison duty. And so for veterans of Shiloh and Corinth and places like that, this seemed like a really good option. There was a little bit of a catch. These officers would not be paid at their new rate until the regiment was recruited up to full strength. And they were responsible for doing the recruiting. So what this meant is that these men would go out on these plantations and recruit, and they would accept anybody they could put in a uniform. Doesn't matter if you have a bad foot, doesn't matter if you are a 12-year-old boy or an 81-year-old man, just come on up here, put the X on the spot on this contract, and you're going to be in the Army. Congratulations. So, and there are, a number of stories where something like that did take place, where these officers would go on a plantation, call all the men on the plantation out, and literally march them off into the Army, just like that. So these white officers go out and they begin recruiting among the African Americans on these plantations. Here you see a scene with many of the men already in uniform. You see a white officer off in the distance making a speech. You see the women saying goodbye to their menfolk. And some of the African American men, of course, they were interested in serving in the US Army and being soldiers, fighting for the freedom of their families, fighting against the Confederacy and the slaveholders. But some of them did have some hesitation. By having all of these men go off to war, it left their women folk very vulnerable. Now, obviously, in a plantation system, the women had been vulnerable to the abuses of the slaveholders. But when all of these African American men joined the Union Army, it also left their women folk vulnerable to the abuse at the hands of Union soldiers. So this is spring, this is around May of 1863. They begin recruiting and then they begin training. And the African-American troops are given literally third-rate weapons. They have already been condemned by the US Ordnance Department. They're Belgian rifles. Some of them are later to be found so bad that the soldiers actually risked the musket blowing up in their face when it was fired. That's the weaponry they're given. One white officer is talking about giving his men target practice, and he's kind of laughing at them because he says, oh, they couldn't hit the broadside of a cotton gin. And so this is all, this is very new for the officers. They're having to learn their duties and responsibilities. And it's very new, of course, for the Black enlisted men as well. So just to kind of recap where we've come. So on January 1st, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation is issued. That makes provision for the enlistment of Black men as soldiers in the Union Army. In April, Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas comes to the Mississippi Valley. He starts recruiting the white officers. In May, the officers go out and begin recruiting among the Black men on the plantations, recruiting them as soldiers. And also in May at the same time, both the officers and the enlisted men are starting to learn their new duties and responsibilities. And it's my belief, my contention, that nowhere else since the earliest days of the war are there so many men who are new and learning their duties and responsibilities. And then June 7th, you have the Battle of Millikens Bend. Now, this is obviously an artist's rendering, but it is reasonably accurate as those sorts of things go. There was a great deal of hand-to-hand fighting at Millikens Bend, and both sides were shocked at the viciousness of the fighting and the level of hand-to-hand combat that took place. So on the Confederate side, the commanders are Henry McCulloch. He's the brother of Ben McCulloch, who was killed at Pea Ridge. We have McCulloch's brigade, who's there. John G. Walker is the division commander, Walker's Texas division. There have been a couple of books about them. They're also known as Walker's Greyhounds because they marched so many different places. Just a review of the regiments that composed McCulloch's brigade. And then on the Union side, we have Colonel Herman Lieb. He is a Swiss immigrant, and he is in charge of what's called the African Brigade. Now, normally he was a regimental commander, but he was in command of the brigade on that day because Colonel Shepard, who you see on the right here, was under arrest. He was under arrest at the time, and not because of what you might expect. He was not drunk on duty. It was not dereliction of duty. He was under arrest because a few days earlier, he had had one of the black enlisted men whip a white Union soldier from the 10th Illinois Cavalry because that soldier from the 10th Illinois had gotten drunk, come over into the camp of the African Brigade, and started assaulting and beating up one of the men. And Colonel Shepard, who was a committed abolitionist, would have none of that. And so he decided he was going to make an example of this man. And that is why he had some of his soldiers whip this man. And there was a court of inquiry that came about, a complaint filed. Shepard was under arrest at the time of the battle, but he was later exonerated because the court of inquiry found that there had been so many negative things taking place in the region against both whites and blacks in the African Brigade and what would later be the USCTs, that something had to be done to prevent these abuses. And Shepard's actions were one effort to stop those kinds of things from happening. And so he was exonerated, he was cleared. But at the time of Millikens Bend, he was under arrest and Lieb was in charge. The Union forces, known as the African Brigade, consisted of the 1st Mississippi Infantry, and the AD stands for African Descent, the 9th Louisiana, the 11th Louisiana, and the 13th Louisiana. 13th didn't last very long. It was actually later folded into these other regiments. They were not yet given their USCT designations. That would come sometime later, about 6 to 9 months later. And so even though these have very Southern sounding names, they are part of the federal forces. Now, in addition, there was a small contingent of men from the all-white 23rd Iowa, about 125 men, which at this point in time was actually about half of the regiment. And I know that's a very small number, but they had been in service for some time. They had also taken pretty big casualties at Big Black River Bridge just a few weeks before. They had been north to escort Confederate prisoners up to Memphis and were on their way back down towards Vicksburg. And Lieb had requested some reinforcements because he anticipated being attacked. And this was what showed up, the 125 men from the 23rd Iowa. Now, out of all the regiments that were present at Millikens Bend, they were the only true veteran regiment. Now, the Texans had been in service for some time, for over a year, but they hadn't seen any major significant combat. The 23rd Iowa had. And so they were really the only true veterans on the battlefield that day. So here's what happened at the Battle of Millikens Bend. So the Confederate forces here in red are coming down one of the roads. There's a community called Richmond off to the west. They come in on the road, and there are two levees in front of the Mississippi River. The Union forces are posted behind this first levee. The Confederates assault the 9th Louisiana at the far left of the Union line, and they're able to get an angle on the 9th Louisiana that makes their position untenable. And so they are forced to fall back. And that is where some of that very severe hand-to-hand fighting occurs, is in this initial phase of the battle. The 1st Mississippi and the 13th Louisiana, they run or withdraw. It's a little unclear exactly which, but in any case, they get out of there. They fall back to the second levee. That leaves the 23rd Iowa. They had spent the night on their transport vessel, and they were just getting into line when the Confederate assault hit them. They too were forced back. Then you had the 11th Louisiana. So by this time, the 11th Louisiana is being attacked by almost the entire Confederate force. They also are forced to fall back. However, there are two companies of the 11th Louisiana that stand firm at the end of the Union line. They are posted behind some cotton bales. They're able to hold their ground. And as they do so, the gunboat Choctaw comes up and begins throwing 100-pound shells onto the Confederate forces. That stops the assault. Meanwhile, the Lexington, which is a timber-clad, it comes up the river. It also begins to throw shells into the Confederate lines. And that the gunboats is what actually stops the Confederate assault. The Confederates then withdraw. They're hopeful that some reinforcements will show up. But at this point in time, it's 95 degrees in the shade. It's midday. And there's also a great deal of uncertainty among the Confederates about whether or not there might be additional gunboats showing up. And so the assault is not resumed. And that is the end of the actual Battle of Millikens Bend. Now, it lasted about four or 5 hours, even though it was a relatively small engagement. And so that's, that seems like kind of the end of the story, but it's really not. So there's an image of the Choctaw and the Lexington. And so I want to talk just a minute about the casualties at Millikens Bend. For McCulloch's brigade as a whole, they lost almost 200 men, and you see it broken down there, about 12% of their initial force. And as Civil War battles go, that's not unusual. It is a significant loss, and it shows the nature of the fighting. And I think one thing to think about and to pause here for a moment is to realize, again, the level of training and weaponry that the African-American troops had. And to have these kinds of losses inflicted on the Confederate side, I think speaks to the bravery and tenacity of the Black troops that were there. And in fact, Henry McCulloch says after the battle that the Negro portion fought with considerable obstinacy. So even he was impressed with the fighting that the Black troops showed that day. Now, on the Federal side, the poor 23rd Iowa, with only 125 men, lost more than half of its force killed and wounded. The African Brigade as a whole lost a third of its force killed and wounded. The 11th Louisiana had 2 companies captured almost in their entirety. They were out on picket duty, so they were actually ahead of the federal lines, and they were kind of scooped up in their entirety. So they had some significant losses through that. And then there's the 9th Louisiana. They lost almost 200 men. That is 68% of the initial force that they brought to the battle. That is the highest percentage loss of any African-American unit in the entire war. They had 23% killed outright, killed in action. And significant for this group, that is even greater than the losses of the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg. Long credited with the greatest loss of any regiment during the war. The 9th Louisiana also lost 66 killed in action. When we're talking about Civil War battles, that sounds like a small number. But when you compare it to other losses amongst federal troops during the Vicksburg campaign, that's the highest loss of any Union unit during a single engagement in the entire Vicksburg campaign. That includes Champion Hill, that includes Big Black River Bridge, that includes the assault of May 22nd. So it is significant. So that's what took place kind of on the ground there at Millikens.
Question?
Yes.
Do you allow questions?
I'd like to hold those till the end, if that's okay.
Okay, because it was related to that last 3 slides. So
Okay, go ahead.
you mentioned troops killing the Confederates. What about those boats? Did they keep separate stats?
Oh, for the casualties that occurred
Yeah.
on the boats?
Yeah.
Yes,
Not
they
on
are
the
separate.
boats, that the boats inflicted on the Confederates.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. That breakdown I do not have.
Okay.
So, and that's a good point. Thank you. Okay. So the reason I say that Millikens Bend is one of the most important battles you've never heard of is that its significance comes later. Okay. It's a small battle. It's only a brigade on either side. It doesn't do anything for the Confederates to relieve the siege of Vicksburg. In many ways, it's just barely a footnote. But I do think it has outsized significance for that. And one of these reasons it's important is the prisoner of war issue. Edmund Kirby Smith was in charge of the entire Trans-Mississippi region for the Confederacy. Richard Taylor was his subordinate. And then following the chain of command down, you have General Walker and Henry McCulloch. Edmund Kirby Smith writes to Taylor shortly after Millikens Bend. I hope that your subordinates, meaning Walker and McCulloch, recognize the propriety of giving no quarter to armed Negroes and their officers. In other words, don't take any prisoners. You need to take care of this on the battlefield. Now, Kirby Smith was just following Confederate law. On April 30th, the Confederate Congress authorized the execution of white officers in command of black troops on the basis of inciting servile insurrection. Remember, we talked about that fear of slave insurrection earlier. Same thing. Blacks taken in arms against the Confederacy were to be handed over to state authorities and dealt with according to state law. Well, all states in the Confederacy had laws on the books that said slaves in insurrection should be executed. And that was even prior to the war. Now, there were a lot of rumors in the aftermath of Millikens Bend in terms of what happened to white and black prisoners that were taken by the Confederates at that fight. And one of the things, and I won't go into the details here, but it does ebb and flow in terms of, like, sometimes it seems like they were executed, sometimes it seems like they weren't. But in August of 63, Brigadier General John Stevenson takes an expedition, this is federal troops, takes an expedition out to Monroe, where the Confederate forces were. Confederates withdraw, and they begin investigating. And what they find is that Captain Cordon Heath of the 9th Louisiana and Lieutenant George Kahn of the 11th Louisiana were executed at Monroe sometime after their capture at Millikens Bend. And this is based on interviews that they conducted with quote unquote Union civilians in the area, but also Confederate soldiers that were recuperating in the hospital there at Monroe. And there is more information about that. So this is what happened to some of the white officers that were captured there. What happened to the black men who were captured? You know, that's something that I still wish I had more information on. It's been very difficult to trace what happened to them. Some of the records from the regiments were lost. They were just organizing, so these were early records. Some of those records were lost in the fight itself. What I have been able to find out is that it seems like most of the black enlisted men were returned to slavery in some form. Maybe not necessarily returned to the former slaveholder that they had labored for before, but McCulloch gives some of these black prisoners to some of his men as a quote unquote reward. Some of these black soldiers labor on Confederate fortifications for the Confederate Army. However, just as significant, some of these black soldiers are treated as legitimate prisoners of war. Now, I wish I had more information. That's as much as I can tell you for sure, because their military records show that they were held as prisoners, and these are federal military records. They are held as prisoners in Texas. It doesn't say where, but they are returned to their regiment at the end of the war. Now, it still remains likely, I would say, that some of these black soldiers were executed, either shot down when they surrendered on the battlefield or killed shortly thereafter. So it's not clear what happened to them, and it's not clear what happened. They do not seem to have been treated the same. There's a variety of outcomes here. I've looked at pension records, and some of those are frustratingly nondescript. Even some of the prisoners held in Texas just simply say prisoner in Texas. So that's been very frustrating. It's something that I still hope to continue to look into. But the other important thing about this prisoner situation is Colonel Lieb writes a report after the expedition to Monroe. Lieb writes a report and sends it directly to the Assistant Adjutant General in Washington. That report is then forwarded to the Secretary of War and a Congressional Investigating Committee. And it's basically taken as evidence and as testimony about how Confederates are treating Union prisoners of war taken from African-American regiments. This report certainly and clearly contributes to the decision of Congress to stop prisoner exchanges between the North and South. And the reason they stopped those prisoner exchanges is because Confederates are not treating both officers and men from African-American troops as legitimate prisoners of war. So I think that's particularly significant, given the fact that this is such a small battle. In addition, Millikens Bend, that happens in early June. Port Hudson, also in Louisiana, happens just a week before in late May. And Fort Wagner, which many of you may be familiar with, the story of the 54th Massachusetts, that's in South Carolina, that comes in July. All three of these battles just kind of came one after another, and they did a lot to help begin to change public opinion among Northern whites about the appropriateness of having Black troops serve in the Union Army. And in fact, there's one soldier who's from Grant's Army. He's recuperating in the hospital, and he writes his wife shortly after Milliken's Bend. And he says, all are astonished at their fighting qualities. Now, just a few weeks before, he had been making jokes about the fact that these former slaves were wearing Union uniforms. So he was converted. And then also Milliken's Bend is used to advocate and encourage recruitment, particularly among free Blacks in the North. These are excerpts from a famous broadside that was issued shortly after Milliken's Bend and before Fort Wagner. So this would be in June of '63. It's endorsed by Frederick Douglass, and it is encouraging free Blacks in the North to enlist in the Union Army. There's another piece of this broadside that says, are free men less brave than slaves? So it's almost taunting them and encouraging them to enlist. So that's the end of my formal presentation. There is much more to the story. There is all kinds of little ins and outs and subtleties with some pieces of this story. Connections to George Gordon Meade and his slaveholding sister in Mississippi. There's more about the incident with Colonel Shepard and why he was under arrest. It also looks at Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era and brings it up to modern day to look at, why was this battle so forgotten, and why should it be remembered today, and in what ways is it being remembered? So there's much more to the story, but I do think it's very much an important battle, even though it was a very small one, and it's worth us remembering today. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. We will. Could you stop sharing your screen? Perfect. There you are. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Linda? One. Maybe can you come up here, Ken? Could you come up here? Use the mic.
Yeah, I was just reading about Texas Rangers, and what excited me was the very first group of Texas Rangers that are full world units actually were infantry troops that came back from the battle in Louisiana and fire slogans. Do you know anything about that?
Bailey, can you repeat that for me? I heard about Texas Rangers.
Yeah, the very first group of Texas Rangers that I know throughout the world, they were actually a group of infantrymen that came back from Louisiana and formed the very first Texas Rangers regiment, or group, whatever you want to call it. Most of the Texas Rangers were actually just kind of brigands that looked for something to do, but the very first ones were actually Confederate soldiers.
I don't know anything about Texas Rangers as Confederate soldiers, but what I can tell you is that Henry McCulloch was a Texas Ranger. And he, prior to the war, he was engaged in some Indian fighting. I can also tell you that Kirby Smith was initially at the start of the war when he was still in United States service. He was serving at a Texas outpost. And so there are some pre-war connections there. But I'm afraid I don't know anything specifically about Texas Rangers in the Confederate Army.
We're having our guests come up to the microphone.
I'm just kind of curious how this small group of the 23rd Regiment, Iowa, got involved in their evolution down there, their progression out of Louisiana.
Sure. Yes. So the Iowans they were already part of Grant's army, and they had crossed the Mississippi River into Mississippi as part of the move on Vicksburg. And they had fought at Big Black River Bridge, which is in Mississippi, and it's part of the prelude to the assault on Vicksburg. And they had been sent north on the Mississippi River to escort some Confederate prisoners up to Memphis. And so they were on their way back down to rejoin Grant's army when they were basically kind of diverted to show up here and support the troops at Milliken's Bend as reinforcements.
Fine presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Has your research compared the deaths of Black troops at the Fort Pillow massacre with those at Millikens Bend?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think they're very different situations. One of the things that happens at Millikens Bend, and I kind of shortened everything in my presentation, but one of the things that I find at Millikens Bend with the Confederate forces from Henry McCulloch all the way up to Kirby Smith is, just like I was talking about, this was a new experience for the white officers and the former slaves on the Union side. It was also a new experience for Confederate forces to encounter Black troops on the battlefield. This was all new for everyone, and everyone was kind of trying to figure out, what do we do and how do we handle this situation? And that's true on the Confederate side as much as it is on the Union side. And what I find with the Confederates at Millikens Bend is that there's a lot of confusion. They kind of just don't know what to do. I mean, I can certainly imagine, almost in a comic way, the Confederate forces taking some Black men prisoner at Millikens Bend and saying, now what? Like, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to treat them as prisoners? Are we supposed to treat them as slaves? Are we supposed to treat them as slaves in insurrection and rebellion? There's very much a lot of confusion, but there also seems to be a lot of concern among the Confederate generals to do whatever the Confederate government wants them to do. Because they're out in the Trans-Mississippi, it takes a long time for correspondence to go from this region to Richmond, Virginia, and back. And what you see is kind of a lot of debate and kind of almost making it up as they go. And eventually, they do find out that, this law has been passed. And some of them, I think, are like Kirby Smith, are more inclined to just simply take some sort of action so that this notion of, freedom does not spread too far, too fast in the region. And at Millikens Bend, most of what I have found so far is that any executions that did take place did not take place on the battlefield or in the heat of battle. In the case of the two officers, that was clearly at least a week or possibly even a month after the battle when those executions took place. There's another engagement that happens in the region near a place called Lake Providence. It's a couple weeks later. Other troops are involved, but there are some Black troops involved in that one. And it seems like what happened there is that some of these men were slowing down the Confederate retreat or movement. And so they killed them then, just because they couldn't be burdened by these prisoners. So again, though, it's not in the heat of battle, it's after the fact. What happens at Fort Pillow is a different thing entirely. excuse me just a moment. What happens at Fort Pillow is very much a deliberate, calculated action on the battlefield to take no prisoners and to just slaughter them, you know. This is much further in the war. It's a year later. You know, I'm from Tennessee. There's always lots of debates about Nathan Bedford Forrest here, you know. But what I have seen and what my understanding is of Fort Pillow is that it is quite a different situation. That that the Confederate forces come in there, and even after the black troops surrender, they are immediately shot down on site on the battlefield. I think in both cases, the similarity is that the actions that are taken by the Confederate forces are done so with the notion of deterring further similar actions by the Union Army, by white officers out recruiting black troops, and kind of trying to send a message to the freedmen in the area that this is what you have to look forward to if you enlist in the Union Army. And there is some discussion in the aftermath of Millikens Bend about that very thing. And Colonel Shepard writes that, you know, his men are not intimidated by this. If anything, they're more committed. They're more committed to serving in the Union Army. They're more committed to the cause of freedom. They are not intimidated or deterred in any way. And so, you know, I think that that's the outcome that happens at Millikens Bend.
Yeah, I have one.
Can we ask a question?
I have one question on the soldiers that left, the white soldiers that left regiments for the Union to transfer into officers. I had a great granduncle who was in the 4th Minnesota as a sergeant and then transferred. I'm looking in the Minnesota, it's called the Minnesota the Civil War book, lists all the rosters. And in their company roster, he's listed as a sergeant discharged or promoted, discharged for promotion in the 12th Colored Infantry in July of 1863. But in another area, he's listed as a captain with what is called by then in September of 63, the 58th Regiment of Colored Infantry. So, and I've read different places where there, some of these colored regiments were called state regiments like Mississippi, and others were U.S. colored troops like federal troops. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But I'm assuming with a number like 58th Regiment, that maybe was, I think that was a Mississippi regiment. I think I've read for him someplace.
Well, what happened is that, just using Millikens Bend again as an example, so when the Union first began recruiting African-American troops, they were typically given state designations. In the case of Millikens Bend, those regiments were recruited in Louisiana and recruited in Mississippi. So that's why they were given Louisiana and Mississippi designations. You also have like the 54th Mass. So they were recruited in Massachusetts. The US colored troops were officially formed in, I believe it was May of 63, meaning the administration was put in place for that. in the case of the regiments that fought at Millikens Bend, they did not receive the U.S. Colored Troops designation until probably 6 to 9 months later. It was quite a ways later before they had their names changed. And so, for instance, one of the regiments, the 9th Louisiana, as an example, they later became the 5th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. So even though they started as the 9th Louisiana Infantry, they later become the 5th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. And so you do see those name changes. The best resource that I can suggest to follow those through is, I can see it and I'm trying to make sure I get it right. Oh gosh. I'm gonna have to look it up. I can see it. The guy's name, I think, is Francis. I can't get his last name. It's not Numbers and Losses. It's not Livermore. Somebody out there, I bet, knows the one I'm talking about. The one that gives all the unit histories. 3 volumes. I'll have to get back to you on that. But it will take the regiments and tell you kind of when they changed their names. Some of the regiments at Millikens Bend went through 3 or 4 different names before they kind of settled. And one thing that I would encourage you to look for is, in addition to the records of your ancestor who served in the 4th Minnesota, the Minnesota Regiment.
Yeah, correct, 4th Minnesota.
I would encourage you to request records associated with those other regiments, because it could be that he served with the 12th U.S. Colored Infantry, and maybe that later became the 58th, or maybe he had a promotional opportunity and he changed regiments completely. But in any case, the 12th and the 58th are going to have their own records. And so I would encourage you to look into that as well.
Okay.
I'm referring to that part we talked about in Texas where men wanted to join the North rather than just come to California, and they were for that. I was reading something about that where men that lived in the northern states wanted to join the Confederacy for free, and allowed to leave at their own will. Are there any cases where the northern states killed men that wanted to join the Confederacy Army?
I'm sorry, I really had a hard time hearing that. If you could try repeating again.
What was your question?
Well, Texas executed people that wanted to join the Northern Army, but the Northern Army freely let anybody who wanted to join the Confederacy walk. Are there any cases where the northern states killed potential Southern?
Are there any cases that you've heard of where the northern states executed citizens who wanted to join the Confederate Army?
Oh, well, what I can tell you is that one of the stories that comes kind of later after Millikens Bend, and again, it's something that, I'm still looking into stuff. At a certain point, I just had to say, I'm not going to have all the answers, so I've got to put together what I've got. But so one of the regiments that fought at Millikens Bend, later known as the 51st U.S. Colored Infantry, fights at the end of the war at Fort Blakely, Alabama. And at Blakely, there is kind of the reverse of what happened at Millikens Bend. There is the accusation that the black troops shot down surrendering Confederate forces on the battlefield. Now, the accounts that I have seen indicate that the black troops were yelling, "Fort Pillow, Fort Pillow." And this, of course, does take place after Fort Pillow, which was in 1963. And it does seem like that most of the accounts that I have read indicate that, I believe, I may be wrong on the number, but I think it was a 70-something regiment, 76th, 79th U.S. Colored Infantry, who seemed to take most of that action at Fort Blakely. but there's some evidence that the 51st may have been involved as well. Now, I do know that part of the breakdown of the prisoner exchanges was in part, Lincoln said that he would have, both sides said that they would have a policy of retaliation. So Lincoln said, for every US soldier that is shot down without mercy, I will execute a Confederate prisoner of war. For every US soldier that's returned to slavery, I will put a Confederate prisoner at hard labor. There's a book called, I'm not good on my books today, folks. I think it's When This Cruel War is Over. I may be mistaken on the title, but it's about the whole prisoner of war situation. And it's a very good book about that situation, both in terms of just the prisoner of war situation in general, but also the different actions that were taken by both governments.
Thank you. Just a question I was going to ask is, given the ferocity of the fighting by the Black troops, did they ever go up in the NCO ranks, or did they ever receive a field commission and for officers?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking that. What I found with most of the troops that were at Millikens Bend, first of all, yes, they're even as early as Millikens Bend, some of those Black men were non-commissioned officers, corporals and sergeants. Now, at the time of Millikens Bend, most of the first sergeant positions were also held by whites. And part of the issue with these particular troops were most of these men were former slaves, and many had no education in terms of literacy, reading and writing. And so the Army runs on paperwork. If you can't fill out your morning report forms and submit those to your officers, nothing's going to happen. And so that's primarily one reason why the first sergeants were white at this point in time. But there were definitely sergeants and corporals who were African Americans here. Later in the war, there were a few Black men who were officers, not in any of these particular regiments that are in the Millikens Bend study, but elsewhere in the Union Army. But most of those were very few, and that was a matter of policy. The other thing that I should mention, and that does change this answer a little bit, is the Black troops that were present at Port Hudson, which took place on May 28, 1863, so just a little bit before Millikens Bend. Those were the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards. Most of those men were free Blacks and Creoles from New Orleans. And they had been in service. They have kind of their own unique history, and it's a very interesting story. But most of those men had been in service for some time. Many of those individuals were educated, and most of the officers in those regiments, when they were organized, were in fact Black officers. But at the time, just before and after Port Hudson, one of those regiments, the General Nathaniel Banks, had come in and said, no more Black officers. And he replaced all of those men with white officers. And that took place just prior to Port Hudson. And then shortly after Port Hudson, the same thing took place with the other regiment. There's a book by James Hollingsworth called Louisiana Native Guards that tells their story. And so, but by and large, with the United States Army in general, most of the officers throughout the U.S. colored troops were white men.
All right, well, I think that's it for questions. I want to thank Linda for coming virtually to our roundtable. Thank you so much for telling us about the battle. Where could our guests get your book if they were interested in learning more?
Yes, it's available on Amazon, and also it's published by LSU Press. And so either of those places. Could also go to my website, which is millikensbend.com, and there's more information there. I do blog occasionally. I'm not as regular about it as I'd like to be, but I do put more information as I find it. It's also available as an ebook and an audiobook as well.
Wonderful. Well, that'll be a wrap on this month's meeting on the roundtable. Thank you everyone for coming. See you next time.
Thank you.